Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today we have our econ show because of President's Day, we shifted EIA to Thursday. We have econ today, and just because the data for EIA takes a little bit longer to come out on federal holidays that are on a Monday. So we'll still provide some color for you. We probably, when we're filming the fourth episode of this, the fourth segment of this, we'll get Fed minutes, but in the meantime, we'll give you an idea of what's been going on so far. We're going to start off with there's food shortages, how they're expanding, and why that's driving more polarization. Remember, that's been a common theme we've been talking about in terms of the issues abroad for the cost of living, the food shortages, energy shortages, and how that's driving that polarization piece. Then we want to look at small banks and are they in trouble on a balance sheet basis based on these credit card delinquencies and some of the pressure that they're going to have on their on just managing some of their credit risk. Then we're going to look to real estate, the data. Remember, we talked about there was a bit of a reprieve. Well, some of that data has worsened again. We want to look at, what does it mean to worsen and turn negative? Is it setting new records? Then we want to look at the EU, because some of the economic data, as we've been talking about, has bottomed. But one of the things that we've been talking about is that it's going to bottom, but we're not going to get a huge bump up. It's going to rally. It'll nothing, when you look at economic data, just like everything else, it's a living and breathing thing. So it's going to ebb and flow, but are you going to get higher highs, higher lows, or is it something where you're just going to get this chevron pattern to the sideways? Then we want to turn to Asia, and the PBOC has cautioned about additional stimulus and why that's the case based on leverage ratios and what is happening, as well as Asia. We talked aggressively at times on how Japan continues to struggle to maintain their cap. They had to do another extraordinary buying of bonds to maintain the ceiling, and again, the market is going to keep pressing that until it finally breaks. So with that being said, we want to turn to what we've been seeing, and again, the social protest surge. So there's a rise in political uncertainty, and when you look at it, it's not only international, but also domestic. Now, with households facing 20% higher price levels than in 2019, social protests are at a new peak. During COVID, obviously only 30% of global protests were economically motivated, now 2/3. And that's a big component, because how is the government going to react? Like, what is the government going to do? And not just, when I say government, I should say governments. Like, how are, now, globally speaking, governments going to try to address these underlying issues, because there continues to be a significant amount of problems around the world. When you look at food, when you look at subsidies, in India, we had a big spike in inflation because several levels of subsidies that came in during the COVID period expired on the food side, sent food prices soaring. And that, again, is a big piece of it, because one of the things that we keep talking about, and I'm not trying to be an alarmist or someone that is sitting here and is a fear monger, but if you can't feed the people you love, you will kill to feed them. That is what we have been. We're animals. That is a distinction we have made. And it's unfortunate to say it like that, but, obviously we have the poor in the U.S., and for many of those watching, you're in the U.S., we have poor here. I am not saying that we don't, but a poor person in America and a poor person in Ethiopia and Nigeria and places of the emerging market world are vastly different. And that's just the backdrop of it. And even in the U.S., even though our poor are different or at a higher standard than that, there's still stealing and an increase in crime and an increase in some of these different pieces. We can go back and forth on how much of that is a change in policy on prosecution and whatnot. But again, inherently speaking, that has been the case. Then you go abroad and you've seen a big increase in economic stress. You've seen an increase in inflation. You've seen a decrease in food availability. And if you think back to the 30s, that was really what we were facing. We had the Dust Bowl. We had rampant inflation in large areas, the broad food shortages. You had bread lines. That creates strife. That creates people that are going to search for an answer, and they're going to protest. They're going to show their displeasure, and someone is going to harness that and take advantage of it for better or for worse. And we know where World War II came from. That was for the worse. It doesn't have to go that route. It just happened to go that route based on who came to power. But these are key pieces that we have to look at, and some of the key drivers, because it's a big issue. And here's, I think, a great statistic where nearly 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. Now, if you're eating, whether it's a healthy diet, unhealthy diet, a diet that may not be calorically sufficient, but at least you'll survive, it is important. And that's why, obviously, you look at the U.S. in terms of the share of the population, and there's a bubble. It's just very light and small. But when you look abroad, and that's why we turn to Africa, we turn to Asia, there is a broad issue. And this is what governments are going to want to look at, of how do we try to supplement, because you look at China, you look at India, there is a significant amount of people that live in these areas. China has rolled out a significant amount of subsidies and stimulus measures to direct towards the food side. And for those that don't know how the China typically sets policy for the year, you have the Communist Congress where they set the election period, who's going to take what position where, and then Xi goes on or not only just Xi, but anyone in his position will go around and give these very high level talks to very upper level institutions and conferences, and he provides a broad stroke of policies. And a lot of them are bullet points, and then his people are meant to craft and fill in within those bullet points. They then release either articles, academic papers, and things that are going to really drive that policy for the year. And it's no surprise that food and fertilizer is a huge component of it. They're trying to drive more food yield and food diversity, trying to increase rural farming, trying to protect cost. And one of those is withholding exports of fertilizer and trying to make fertilizer cheaper internally. And the problem with that is China is the largest creator of fertilizer in the world. And that is going to have ramifications when you look at what that outset and what those impacts will be. It's no surprise that the cost of a healthy diet increased. I mean, anybody watching this just has to go to the food store, or at least look at their receipt of the last time they went to the food store, and you'll know that that's just, I'm not stretching here by saying that happened. So when you look at the impacts, it's obviously going to vary based on where and how much it is adjusted. So in Africa, you can see where the adjustment has been. When you look at North America and Europe, you can see how much the adjustment has been in general. And that's going to be a continuous problem, because not only have we seen the diet become more unaffordable, we've also seen real wages go down. So inflation-adjusted wages are declining across advanced economies. And if it's declining across advanced economies, I can assure you it's declining across emerging markets, because, again, FX rates, FX movements, rate movements, all of these things are going to impact the affordability and the ability of people to actually spend money. And that's going to adjust. Now, the global sales manager index has improved. There is some of that bouncing back and forth. But the question is, and this is where the broader theme is, nothing goes down in a straight line. But are we going to see a big improvement, or was this kind of the lull coming out of December, and then we're going to see some of the stress going forward, because food spending and the share of income spent on food across U.S. households, the U.S. on average, prior to let's call it 2018, 2019, the average person spent between 18 and 24 cents of every dollar earned on food. In the most extremes in the emerging market world, it's up to 87 cents. On average, on a global basis, it's anywhere between 40 to 45 cents. And that was in 2019. So we know that prices have only gone up. So again, all of that has shifted. Now in the US, it's between 30 and 34 cents. So if we went from 18 to 24 to 30 to 34, and emerging markets were already at 87 cents, well, now are they over that hump, which is why these subsidies become so important when we look at these underlying impacts. And farm costs have gone up. I mean, as we've talked about, interest expense. Most farmers and farming, they can't afford to buy the seed and fertilizer with cash on hand, so they go out and borrow. But borrowing rates have gone up. So the cost has to go up and then they have to pass that down. Obviously, fertilizer prices have come up. Yes, they've come down, but it's important. And we had this conversation on Twitter because somebody, I had said that it was crazy for Senator Warren to come out and say that egg prices have spiked and this is gouging. And I said, no, this is an issue, but you have to look at where the problem is. And I made a snarky comment that give me a box of crayons and and an Investopedia link, and I would be able to explain it in 30 seconds. And somebody had said that it's worth questioning, and I agree that it's worth questioning to a point. And then they said that prices have come down. Prices have come down, but you have to zoom out. So yes, are they off the highs? Absolutely. But they're still at the highest level it's been at since 2016 when you take out that spike. So you're still at the highs, historically speaking, and that's the underlying problem. And whenever, for those in the supply chain, when you get a massive spike up and down, you can't pass all that cost through at once. So there's a delay in the cost pass through and there's a delay on the cost coming down. And that's normal. That doesn't really require some big investigation. That is just a normal interaction. But one of the important things, and this is where we come to this chart, you're going to re-rate higher. You're not going to get back to the lows that we had in 2016, 2017. Rates don't allow for it. Fertilizer costs don't allow for it. Seed cost doesn't allow for it. All of those things, because, if you're raising eggs, you have chickens. Chickens eat food. Food costs money. All of these things, again, just keep pivoting up. And even as they come down off their highs, they're getting to this sticking point where we see this perpetual problem. And the level and composition of global support to food and agriculture. So when you look at those fiscal subsidies and where those price incentives are, where the general services are, how much of that is going to fade away? And that's what we've been talking about, where we've already started to see them fade back, and that's resulted in a big spike in inflation and realistically impacts to the emerging market world and the poorest level. Now, if you can't, and if those individuals can't eat, again, we're not talking about I wanted steak tonight and instead I had to have chicken. I'm talking where these people are not able to get a bowl of rice and they may not be able to get a loaf of bread for multiple days. That's going to drive action, and that's going to drive people to take a bit crazy action and aggressive action. And that's sometimes when we become myopic and look at just ourselves within the US, we kind of forget the problems and strain on a global level, which again is going to drive some of that. And when you look at, again, the fertilizer cost, Russia and Belarus, just look at when you put those two together, you're talking about near 40 million tons of fertilizer that is going to be hindered. China's talking about and has already started to withhold a certain amount of exports. India is they have their own issues. They've already put gates up on sugar. They've already shown that there's sugar problems. Latin America is struggling to source not only fertilizer because a lot of it comes from Russia, but also they are facing their own heat wave. So it provides other opportunities for different areas, especially the U.S., obviously Canada, and through one of our investments, there's some abilities to try to drum up additional fertilizer production in not only Latin America but also in the Middle East. And it's no surprise to see that the U.S. is taking advantage of this. We have had a decent start to the export demand market, because when you look at shortages and global food levels are being taken down because of droughts that are hitting Latin America, which is a huge piece of the wheat and soybean market, that becomes a problem, and that becomes a continuous issue, which is why you have to turn to alternatives, the U.S. being one of them. Now, when we look at the moderate or severe food insecurity, it remains stable at the global level despite increases in every region except Asia. So Asia flatlined a bit, but a lot of that is because China has done extraordinary things, fiscally speaking, to try to stop that. India has done things to try to fiscally stop that. But as that starts to wear thin, what does that mean going forward? And if you look at 2021, which is the last year here, Asia had some benefits because India had extensive support across sunflower, different oils, including sunflower oil, wheat, sugar, corn. On a lot of those, they've gone away. So you're going to get a re-rate higher, which is why the severity is still getting worse. And again, the rate of change has slowed. And it's, as we've talked about, it's really hard to maintain an aggressive rate of change for so long. Hence, when we talk about CPI and inflation, but it doesn't mean that it's improving at the lowest level, especially when you factor in where real wages are and how that's going to be problematic. And the concentration distribution of food insecurity by severity differs greatly across regions. And I will give you 3 guesses what really drives that. Income level. That's, the U.S. is in a lucky position because even though we are the richest country in the world, we can also feed ourselves. And you could say one leads to the other. One, being able to feed ourselves put us in that position. When you look at geographically speaking, we are blessed in terms of the land that we control and how it can produce a significant amount of food. Other people are not in the same situation, and that has created a long-term strife. So they become buyers in the global market, and as the global market tightens, their costs go up, but they were already struggling to pay for it, which is why you get this spiraling impact. And we're going to do another show, a much bigger one on food, that is going to look at some ways to try to address that. And it's no surprise that the comparison of percent of income loss, where global income went down during COVID, like that, and it hasn't improved. And that's because of inflation. That's because of shortages. That's because of commodity shortfalls. That is going to keep that stress, which is why we talk so much about real wages and why that creates a perpetual problem that continues to cycle. And it's going to create more economic strife. It's going to create more upheavals and protests because people want to feed the ones that they love. I am not making that up. And just put yourself in their position. If you have kids, 2 or 3 kids, and they're crying to you because their tummy hurts because they're hungry, I mean, that's going to break your heart. And you're going to do everything in your power to remedy that, whether that means you don't eat, whether that means you go out and steal a bag of rice or a loaf of bread. You're going to do something to remedy the situation. And as that situation persists, the means you will go to fix that is going to become more extreme as well. And between 702 and 828 million people in the world faced hunger in 2021. And again, it's leveling off, but it's still rising. And that's the underlying problem. And we're not getting a bumper crop this year. We're still going to have a problem when you look at underlying food availability. So it's no surprise that that's where we're going to continue to have other problems with the inflation side. So global credit standards and high yield credit spreads. the standards, there's a big disconnect, which is why we believe you're still going to see a lot of these problems in terms of credit spreads going up, because they're essentially betting that central banks are going to pivot. But it's going to be really difficult to see a pivot given the inflationary levels. And there's a view that some of these, the forward earnings in emerging markets is going to turn up. And again, we agree they flatline. That's part of what we've been saying. They're not going to perpetually go down, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get this huge bump up. And that's where we think there's a lot of pressure to go sideways, especially as global exports come down. And just to put it into perspective, and I think this is a really important piece, January prices for everyday grocery items, and this is just looking at the U.S. Obviously, eggs are showing their true colors, but everything has been gradually moving up. Now, it's important to understand, well, what does that mean for, and putting it into context, the congressional budget forecasters projected that spending on the food stamp program would cost $127 billion in 2023. It cost $65 billion in 2018, with much of the increase coming from extra aid Congress authorized during the pandemic, in addition to other changes made to how the benefits are calculated. Well, it's not surprising, and it's essentially telling you that prices pretty much doubled between 2018 to 2023. And for anybody that buys their groceries, to say that they've doubled since 2018, if you could go back in time and look at your credit card statements and look at what you spent normally versus what you're spending now, you might look at that and be like, wow, it's shocking that it is double. And again, these are the pieces that I think are so important when you're looking at what is going to happen at the emerging market level. So it's no surprise that outflows from emerging market debt has increased. You had that run up, and now we think that there's going to be that pullback, but retail net buying is still strong in the U.S. And then there's a big buy-in from the retail market that the worst is behind us. You're going to get, we're going to avoid a recession. You're going to get this bounce. And again, there's always swings, but we would say that the swing has gone too far and that there's going to be some downside. And it's no surprise to see that aggregate emerging market consumer prices have shifted back up on the headline and on the core. And going back to 2004, you can see that we're at a very elevated level. And the problem is when you look at 2008, you had a big spike and fade. And one of the things that we're seeing here is you're not getting a big fade. And you could see that it started to come down and now it's kind of bouncing around. And core prices, again, are elevated. And as you start to level in, subsidies falling away, which means consumer prices are going to take another step up, that's going to become a bigger problem. And again, increased stress, increased problems, which is why we think there is a much bigger issue afoot. Not one that a lot of people really aren't talking about, which is why we have such a broader concern when you look at not only economic health, but also geopolitical stability. And what does that mean as we continue to go forward with the avenues that we have available. So that's what we have for you on the global level. In the next segment, we're going to go deeper into the U.S. and some of the recent data points that have come out over the last few days.